Hello and welcome to our lecture on pelagic communities. So we spoke about life in the ocean in general last week, and now we're going to focus on two different communities this week and next week. Pelagic communities are those organisms that live in the open water. And before we dive in, we're just going to talk about, no pun intended, dive in. We're just going to talk about how marine organisms are organized. Okay, so with these different terms that we use when we talk about the organizations of organisms in an ecosystem. And first, let me start with, say, a population. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species in the same location. Okay, so maybe a school of a particular type of fish, say tuna, living in one area would be considered to be a population. Now, that population lives in a habitat, which is a physical location of that organism or that population of organisms. So you could say there is a population of sea anemone that live in the coral reef. So the group of organisms of the same species, the sea anemone, is the population that lives in the habitat that is the coral reef. And that reef also acts as a community in this case, because a community is when you have many populations of organisms that interact in a particular location, in a particular habitat. So, for example, a coral reef is an excellent example of a community, because you have many species, many different populations, so many different groups of the same species interacting with each other in the same habitat. So when we talk about pelagic communities, we're talking about different populations of species living in a community, interacting with each other in the habitat that is the open ocean, the water column. Right? And now each population within a community and habitat fills a niche. And a niche is what an organism does in its habitat. Basically, how it makes its living, what it eats, how it eats it, how it finds that food, how it avoids being prey. So it's what that particular organism does that's different from any other organism that allows it to be successful. Okay. Now, organisms in a community are always competing with members of the same species, so members of their own population, and members of other species, or members of other populations within that community. They compete for food. If they're photosynthetic, they compete for light. They compete for space, and they compete for other resources. And due to this competition in each organism, how it competes for all these things, that defines what its niche is. And two populations of different organisms cannot be in the same niche, in the same community long term. I like to think of it as in the business environment, right? So you have, say, a habitat maybe is cellular phone companies like Verizon Wireless and so forth. And so I guess the habitat would be our market, and the community would be cellular phone companies. And I guess members of that community of different types of providers. And companies all have their niche, like why you would go with that company. What they're trying to sell is different from other companies. And eventually there's competition, right? There's competition. Some companies do better, some companies do worse. And eventually only one company is going to be able to do what it is particular that it does. If two companies are doing the exact same thing, one of them will eventually win out and beat out the other. So there are multiple companies, multiple cell phone companies that exist, because they're all doing things just a little bit differently. Right? But we don't find two identical companies because they'll outcompete each other, and one will be successful. So I hope that analogy helped and didn't confuse you. So we classify marine environments by location. So we have two major environments. We have the pelagic zone and the benthic zone. The pelagic zone is basically the open water. It's the water column, so it's everything that's not on the sea floor. Where the benthic zone is the sea floor. It's everything that's on the sea floor. Within the pelagic zone, we subdivide it into two zones, the neritic zone and the oceanic zone. The neritic zone is the open water near and over the continental shelf, so near the shore and over the continental shelf. So these are relatively shallow waters. They exist over the continental margin. And the oceanic zone is the water beyond the continental shelf. So this is the deep water above the abyssal plains. That's the oceanic zone. And with the benthic zone, this is the seafloor. We have the littoral zone. This is the intertidal zone. So this is basically the beach that exists between the high tide and low tide. Sublittoral zone is the seafloor just beyond the low tide mark. The bathal zones, and so the sublittoral zones include, let's say, the continental shelf. The bathal zone, those include the continental slopes as we slope down from the shelf to the abyssal plain, which forms a new zone, the abyssal zone. That's below the bathal zone, that's the abyssal plains. And the hadal zone, that's the deepest benthic environment, and that is the bottom of deep sea trenches. Okay, so those are all benthic zones, which we'll talk about a little bit next week, but this week we're going to talk about pelagic organisms, those living in the open water. And so here we have an illustration of those different environments. So we have benthic zones, we have the littoral zone between high and low tide, sublittoral, and then we have the bathal, the continental slope, the abyssal zone, and then the hadal zone, deep sea trenches. And then for pelagic environments, we have the neritic zone, that's the open water above the continental shelf, and we have the oceanic zone, the open water, oceanic zone, the open water above the abyssal plains. Oh, and I should say that this is also subdivided vertically by the different zones of light, which we talked about last chapter. We have the photic zone, which includes the euphotic zone at the top, where there's enough light for photosynthesis. The dysphotic zone, which is there's only enough light for vision, and below that we have the aphotic zone, where there's no light at all. You can see that most of the neritic zone is within the photic zone, and only parts of the pelagic zone are in the aphotic zone. So here is kind of a diagram showing the various different types of organisms that populate pelagic communities. They vary widely in size. So we have very large organisms such as sharks. We have vertebrates and invertebrates. So here's an invertebrate, octopi. We have mammals such as the marine mammals back here. We have mollusks and fish and birds. We even have some reptiles. And if you look very small here, we have these little tiny invertebrates in this small 35 millimeter wide oval. It's expanded here. Those are zooplankton, which eat even tinier. If you look in, this is a little 5 millimeter diameter oval. And here are these little tiny organisms that are called phytoplankton. Okay, and so we're going to start with the phytoplankton and work our way up. We describe these pelagic communities. Okay, so first of all, we've mentioned plankton several times throughout this course. We never formally defined what plankton are. Plankton are any organisms, any pelagic organisms that is, that cannot move well laterally. Some of them can swim partially, some swim to some extent vertically, so they can move up or down slightly, but they cannot swim against the currents. Okay, so they are at the mercy of the currents. They cannot swim laterally. Now, plankton are highly diverse in numbers and types of species, and there's two main groups of plankton: phytoplankton and zooplankton. I'm going to start with phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are photosynthetic plankton, and because they're photosynthetic, they're primary producers, and they are critical to life on Earth. They are the foundation of the food web. So they form organic molecules from inorganic molecules through the process of photosynthesis, and without them we wouldn't have the foundation, the food web to support all the life in the ocean. They're also critical to the generation of oxygen and oxygenating the water through the photosynthesis. Remember, oxygen is a metabolic byproduct of photosynthesis. These phytoplankton, they're thought to bind at least 50 trillion kilograms of carbon into carbohydrates each year. It's a large amount of food they produce. It's about 50% of the food made by photosynthesis each year is by these phytoplankton. So they play a significant role. Now there's 4 groups of phytoplankton, 4 major groups. I'm going to talk about each of them. The first one are the diatoms. Diatoms, they are the dominant and most productive type of photosynthetic plankton, or phytoplankton. So there's more of these diatoms than any other type of phytoplankton, and so they are responsible for more biological productivity or primary productivity than any other type of phytoplankton. They're these really tiny microscopic organisms, and they make these structures, these exoskeletons, out of silica, so they're said to be silicious. If you don't know what silica is, it's the same stuff that glass is made out of. Next we have dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates do not have an exoskeleton like the diatoms do. They're widely distributed single-cellular organisms that are photosynthetic, and they have these little flagella that help them move. One of the reasons why they don't have an exoskeleton is because they live among coral in what's known as a symbiotic relationship. Which we'll talk more about that when we talk about benthic communities, but basically they use the exoskeletons of the coral as protection. Next we have the coccolithophores. So these are single-cellular autotrophs, which are obviously they're photosynthetic, and they're unique because they make their exoskeletons out of calcareous they make their exoskeletons out of calcium carbonate. So they're said to be calcareous. And so whenever they die and their little tiny exoskeletons accumulate on the sea floor, that's what we call calcareous ooze that later lithifies into limestone. So limestone we make cement, chalk, tums. We make a lot of different stuff out of limestone, and limestone is made up of these little tiny structures right here. This is a microscopic image of one of those coccolithophores. So all this stuff is made out of calcium carbonate. And finally, we have the picoplankton. They are a wide group of plankton, and they basically encompass all other types of plankton that, besides the 3 we mentioned, and they're very small. So it encompasses most other types of plankton, which are very small. There's picoplankton. They are also, as I said, photosynthetic. And we study plankton in the ocean using what are these called plankton nets, where we, behind a boat, we will drag these plankton nets where it has this very fine mesh that does not allow water to pass through, but not plankton, and the plankton's funneled down into this this bucket. And then if you drag this net through a certain length of, through a certain distance, you could calculate the volume of water sampled and look at the number and diversity of plankton in that water. That's one way that we can measure the biological productivity of waters in different locations without indirectly measuring the chlorophyll concentration from space. We can do it directly here. I mean, obviously this is difficult because you have to go to different parts of the ocean where a satellite has a bird's eye view and can make more comprehensive measurements. And this is what the satellite provides. So this is a measurement of chlorophyll concentration in the water. Now remember, chlorophyll is a molecule used in photosynthesis. So if you can measure the amount of chlorophyll in the water, you're measuring the amount of photosynthesis in the water, the amount of biological productivity. And we've looked at this map a number of times. And this map basically maps out the distribution of these phytoplankton. So anywhere where you have blues, dark blues, that means that there's very little chlorophyll there and therefore very little photosynthesis. And so we don't have a lot of phytoplankton there. So examples like areas like right here. And why? Well, because we said the water is very warm here, so there's a large thermocline, and therefore a large picnocline, so the water is not vertically mixing, so there's no nutrients at the surface. And the nutrients are necessary for photosynthesis. We have this upwelling along the equator from the converging easterly winds at the ITCZ, driving small amounts of water away from the ITCZ, forcing the upwelling, bringing cold nutrient-rich water to the surface. And we have the higher latitude waters where there's a small thermocline because the surface water is cooler, similar in temperature to the deeper water, and so there is vertical mixing here, bringing nutrient-rich water to the surface. And then finally we have the coastlines where nutrients are flushed into the ocean. So really, when it comes to phytoplankton, for photosynthesis we need light, water, carbon dioxide, and nutrients. And for most parts of the ocean, you have a lot of light, you have a lot of carbon dioxide, and a lot of water. The only thing that is a limiting factor is the nutrients. And so basically, anywhere where we find phytoplankton is a place where we find nutrients. And anywhere where we don't find phytoplankton, that means there's no nutrients. And these phytoplankton are important because they are the primary producers of the ocean. They produce the foundation of the food web that the rest of the life in the ocean, on the planet, lives off of. So the most productive areas, as we mentioned, are those with the high levels of nutrients. Highest nutrients exist near the continents, where we have upwelling of nutrients driven by wind-driven upwellings along coastlines, or nutrients flow into the ocean from rivers. Rivers flush nutrients into the water, river deltas. Tropical waters are very clear because they have few phytoplankton. And why is this? Well, I actually just answered this question in the slide prior, because those tropical waters are stratified. So there's no vertical mixing because there's a very large temperature difference between the surface and the bottom waters. There's a large thermocline yielding a large picnocline, and resulting in a stratification of the water. So next we move on to zooplankton. Now zooplankton are not autotrophs. They don't make their own food. They're heterotrophs. They have to eat other organisms. And what do they eat? Well, zooplankton primarily eat phytoplankton. Now there's four main groups of zooplankton as well. The first group are known as macroplankton. These are all plankton larger than 1 centimeter in size. So on the left we have these ctenophores, which are about the size of a walnut, and on the right we have a sea wasp, which these tentacles can be as long as 50 feet, and they're very poisonous and can kill a human in 3 minutes. So the sea wasp isn't very small. So remember, the definition of plankton is not that the organism is small. It's not that the organism is photosynthetic. It's that the organism cannot swim, cannot actively swim. Okay, like say like this jellyfish, it can move vertically slightly, but it can't swim against the current. Right? It cannot actively swim laterally. So that's the definition of plankton. So these are macroplankton. Zooplankton, they eat phytoplankton, and they're larger than 1 centimeter. Next we have holoplankton. They spend their whole lives as plankton, and they're smaller than 1 centimeter. This is an example of a holoplankton. It's called a copepod. It's a crustacean, like a shrimp or a crab or a lobster, and it feeds on phytoplankton, and it's about 0.2 inches big. It's very, very tiny. Next we have meroplankton. These are zooplankton that only spend part of their life in the planktonic stage, and the other part of their lives either as benthic organisms living on the seafloor, or as nektons, or they're nektonic. We'll discuss what nektons are in a little bit. So, for example, this is a larva of a sea urchin, which, as a larval stage, floats in the water, and so it's considered to be plankton. And as it develops, it will settle to the seafloor and become sea urchin. Many people might not realize, but crabs are also meroplankton. So crabs spend their early stages of life as plankton floating in the ocean. So do clams, oysters, mussels. All those organisms spend part of their life cycle as plankton, zooplankton, and because it's only part of their life cycle as plankton, they're considered to be meroplankton while in that phase. Krill. Krill, they're small crustaceans about the size of your thumb. They live in the Arctic Ocean where there is a lot of phytoplankton because they are relatively large zooplankton, so they need a lot of food. So they need to live where there's a lot of phytoplankton. And where there's a lot of phytoplankton, there's a lot of them. And so there's a lot of other organisms that are eating them, such as baleen whales. So whales need a bunch of food to support that large biomass, and so they go where there is a bunch of primary productivity. And then so they eat these krill feeding off of those phytoplankton. The biomass of krill is actually thought to exceed that of humans. So next we have nektons. Okay, so plankton, those are active swimmers. Sorry, I got the next up. Plankton, those are organisms that cannot actively swim, where nektons are the active swimmers. So they can swim against the current. They actually can have control over the lateral movement of their bodies. Most nektons are vertebrates, though not all are. There are mollusks that are nektons, such as squid and octopi. Also, there are some arthropods, such as shrimp. Shrimp are active swimmers. But among the vertebrates, we have fishes, sea turtles, other marine reptiles, such as marine crocodiles, and marine mammals. So these are arthropods. These are shrimp on Baja Beach. And so these are all nektons, these shrimp that have washed ashore. And an arthropod is an invertebrate animal that has a segmented body and an exoskeleton. So arthropods include crustaceans like shrimp, crabs, lobsters. They include insects, arachnids, and so forth. And there's so many arthropods actually on the planet that they are the most successful group of animals on the planet. So there's so many insects, and crustaceans, and spiders. Fishes, they are the most abundant vertebrates in the ocean. So there's more species and individuals of fishes than species and individuals of all other vertebrates combined. That includes mammals, reptiles, and birds. Amphibians. So there's more species and individuals of fishes than there are all other types of vertebrates combined. And there's two groups of fishes, cartilaginous fishes and bony fishes. Cartilaginous fishes are those that do not have calcified bone. Their skeletons are made out of cartilage. Cartilage is that same stuff that your end of your nose and your ears is made up of. And cartilaginous fishes include sharks, right here, there's a great white, skates, see over here, rays, and chimeras. Remember, skates, you can see their egg cases, sometimes referred to as mermaid purses. You find them on the beach. They kind of look like that, these little black sacs, and that's where skates lay these egg cases, and they hatch out of them. And the interesting thing, sharks are some of the oldest type of fishes on the planet. And since they're cartilaginous, the only calcified bone they have in their body is actually their jaws and their teeth. So the only fossils we find of sharks are of their jaws and their teeth. We don't find any other parts of sharks fossilized because that's the only calcified bone that they have in their body. The rest of their skeleton is cartilage. Bony fishes are the most abundant and successful type of fish, and they are very, very diversified. About 90% of all living fishes are contained within this group, the bony fish, and they include very common species I'm sure most of you heard of, include cod, tuna, halibut, goldfish, seahorses, all different types of fish. So if you're thinking of a fish, most likely it is a bony fish. And what makes a bony fish different from a cartilaginous fish, it has calcified bone. Its bones are made up of calcium. So fishes are so successful because they are very well adapted to their environment, the ocean. So you can see this in how their shape and the way they propel themselves. It's streamlined for living in water, which is a denser fluid than air. So they have to be able to move through this denser fluid, so they have this nice hydrodynamic body. And they can move by moving their fins and using very little energy. They can swim. And also, fish are slimy if you feel them, because that layer of slime helps reduce the friction between their bodies and the water, so helping them use less energy to propel themselves through the water. Also, if you're living in the water, you have to maintain level. That can use a lot of energy, say like if you were trying to tread water in a swimming pool. So in order to maintain level, a certain depth in the ocean without having to constantly exert energy in swimming to maintain that level, they have what's called a swim bladder. And this swim bladder inflates and deflates with air to adjust its buoyancy so that it can float at different levels. Because as you go deeper, the density of water changes, and so the water has to change. The fish has to change the amount of water in its swim bladder, amount of air, in its swim bladder, so that it has neutral buoyancy with the water at that depth. And gas exchange. So fish are animals; they need oxygen, so they got to be able to metabolize their food. So they have to be able to extract oxygen that's dissolved in the water. And so we'll talk about that a little more in a second. And feeding and defense. Obviously, they have to find food, and they have to prevent from being food. So there's a lot of competitive pressure among all these fish, and that has caused a wide variety of feeding habits to evolve and a significant amount of diversity among fish. So here we see a fish's gill system, how it performs this gas exchange, how it extracts oxygen from the water. So the water flows in through the fish's jaws and then through its gills. Now, its gills consist of these bones called gill arches and these soft tissue called gill membranes that extend off of the arches. Now, if you zoom in on this gill arch, you'll see in this gill arch there are two blood vessels. There's an artery and a vein. So an artery is taking blood from the heart, from the heart, and the vein is taking blood to the heart. I think I have that correct. But so the red is oxygen rich and the blue is oxygen poor. So what happens is blood comes from the heart in the vein, or in this blue blood vessel. I don't know if it's called a vein. This is blue blood vessel. The blood comes from the heart, and then it comes to this blood vessel, and it goes into these gill membranes on this side and on this side. And note that the water is flowing through the membranes in this direction, so this oxygen poor blood is entering the membranes on the down current side. And then through these little tiny capillaries, this water is pushed to these membranes in which oxygen dissolves from the water into the blood. So that by the time the blood moves through these little tiny membranes, it has been oxygenated, in which that blood then goes to this oxygen-enriched blood vessel. It goes to the heart to be pumped to different parts of the body. So we have fishes, and then we have marine reptiles, another group of Nektons and marine vertebrates. Of the marine reptiles, we have turtles, sea snakes, and marine lizards such as iguanas and marine crocodiles. This is a marine crocodile, and that's with the late Steve Irwin, known as the crocodile hunter. And so marine reptiles. There's not too many of them. Those are the reptiles that are adapted to live in salt water. Then we have marine birds. Okay, so they are some of the world's most efficient flyers, having to fly sometimes many, many, many miles between land outposts. There's only about 270 known species of birds that qualify as seabirds, and in order to be a seabird, the bird has to have salt-excreting glands that eliminate excess salt taken in by their food, through their food. So there are four main groups of seabirds. Include the tube noses. These are the albatrosses and the petrels. We have the pelicans. Pelicans and grab fish and eat fish in our large pouches. The gulls, the seagulls, and finally, last but not least, the penguins. Okay, so these birds have actually lost their ability to fly, but they are excellent swimmers. Their wings have adapted into flippers they use to swim through the Antarctic and southern hemisphere waters. Interesting fun fact, penguins are really only found in the southern hemisphere of the planet. So then we have marine mammals. And of these marine mammals include the largest animals to have ever lived on the planet. Okay. There are three main groups of marine mammals. Cetacea, include porpoises, dolphins, and whales. Carnivora, those are the mammals that have teeth specialized for eating meat. And then Sirenia. These include the manatees and dugongs. In Cetacea, at least the whales, there's two groups. We have the Odontoceti, those are the toothed whales, like the sperm whale, what Moby Dick was, and the orca, the killer whale. And then the narwhal, which has one tooth that sticks through its lip and looks like a giant tusk. So those are all toothed whales. And then we have the Mysticeti. These are baleen whales. And baleen whales, their teeth have adapted to these large plates with bristles on them that they use to filter plankton, like krill, out of the water. And these include the humpback whale, the right whale, and many other well-known ones, including the blue whale, which is the largest known animal to have ever lived on the planet. And here is a picture of those baleen teeth. These long plate teeth have these bristles, so the whale will take a large gulp of water, their throat will expand with that water, and then they will force that water out through their baleen teeth, and all the plankton will be trapped inside their mouth by this baleen, and then they'll swallow that plankton. So this allows them to filter all that plankton out of the water. So they need to eat that plankton because they need a large, abundant food source to support their massive body mass. So here's a picture of a great blue whale next to a dolphin for size comparison. And of carnivora, we have some examples. Elephant seals. You see some female elephant seals out sunning themselves. And the sea otter. So the sea otter eats some fish and also eats some mollusks such as clams and stuff. So now these are all mammals whose teeth are specifically evolved to eat a diet strictly of meat. And then we have a representative of the order Sirenia, and that's the manatee, also known as the sea cows. So they just move slowly through the shallow subtropical waters like in the Everglades of Florida, eating sea lettuce. And because they move so slowly in these shallow waters, these manatees are often injured by the props of boats. So these boats move through the water and their propellers will cut into the backs of these manatees. So it's unfortunate in that some manatees are threatened in that way. And so this slide is just kind of a legend for that one of the images further back in the lecture that helps identify the different species in the image. And that concludes our lecture on pelagic communities. And I'll see you next week for benthic.